Let's set the table for a new year. Will it be in a shiny new downtown tower? A tiny local joint? Maybe your own living room? Will the food be vegan, comforting, zesty? Will the drinks be boozy, buzzy, or have barely any alcohol at all? I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. And I am delighted to spend our first 2024 episode with Devra First, the restaurant critic and food writer for the Boston Globe. Devra, thank you for being here on the Codcast, and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year to you as well.
So I wish I did have a snack before we got started recording so I don't get munchy, so that is a risk. But let's talk about some food, shall we?
Let's do it. I didn't have breakfast, so
This
we're
might
in the
be
same
a
boat.
podcast of hangry people, but we'll see.
Basically, yeah, totally.
So, do you remember actually the first thing that made you think, oh yeah, I'm going to pay attention to food forever?
I think, I mean, don't we all pay attention to food forever? I think I just always paid attention to food and other things as well, but food is, was always just a theme. I grew up in a fairly food-focused household. My mom was always cooking and trying new things. I remember she made risotto before you could get the right kind of rice, and it was kind of a disaster. But it was just always, we were always like trying new foods and interested in the world. And I lived abroad a bit as a kid, so I got exposed to a lot of different kinds of cuisine through that, which I think cemented my interest.
And you ended up, of course, making a career out of it at some point. So how does one end up in that business in case anyone's interested out there?
For me, I think it was sort of right place, right time, right interest. And I think how one might do it now would probably be quite different. But I was working at the Globe, and I had previously worked at the Phoenix, where I first started writing about food here and there on the side. I was a staff editor, but I was writing some shorter food pieces. And then at the Globe, I wound up copy editing the food section every week. So I got to know the food editor at the time, Cheryl Julian, and started writing for her and started pitching in on various column rotations, such that when the previous restaurant critic, Allison Arnett, left, I thought, well, I'll throw my hat in the ring, and wildly got the opportunity to do this job. So it was really fortuitous, and I feel very lucky about it.
Well, have you thought about kind of eras of food criticism as you've really kind of settled in here? How would you sort of distinguish the way that we've talked about what restaurants and what food are kind of worthy of a critical eye and how that's maybe changed over time?
I do think so much has changed over time. You know, Boston has changed so much over time as a food city. It sort of was historically, a bit maybe conservative and stayed that old, notion of the New England Chowder House and all of that. And then there was this sort of really exciting era of independent restaurateurs and innovation, sort of the Todd English, Barbara Lynch, Gordon Hammersley, Jody Adams, Lydia Shire, all those people sort of started coming onto the scene and making Boston a really exciting place to eat. And that sort of kicked off, the modern heyday. But as the economy goes, so goes the food scene. So when I sort of really started writing about food, then it came 2008, and we had a lot of comfort food. Like instead of lobster, it was lobster macaroni and cheese, because it's a business with such thin margins and food costs and overhead and labor. And so, it's really people being creative, with what they can do within a business model and still stay in business if all goes very well. So yeah, I think it's seen a lot of ups and downs. And I think during the pandemic, when we started hearing a lot about what was happening for restaurants and learning about workers' conditions and people's consciousness being raised in some ways about all of the, I think of the duck swimming and it's very elegant gliding on the surface and all of the frantic paddling that goes on underneath. I think as diners began to learn more about that frantic paddling, and we started talking more about labor and living wages, and also as a labor crunch worsened with no really ease in sight for that, we've started to see people trying different models of how to make restaurants work in a more humane way and how to make it work when it's hard to find skilled people to help it run. So, always, I think what keeps me writing about food is that it's a lens onto the rest of the world and that the rest of the world influences it. So, whatever's happening in the economy and real estate and business and the world is always sort of in an interplay with the restaurant ecosystem. And that makes it interesting.
Yeah, and thinking about the pandemic and its impact on the way that we talked about food, really it was right there from the jump. I think, we can all remember seeing the lines outside of the bars right before they all closed for in-person service. And I think March 2020, if we act like that was a real year that we all lived through, there was that weird ghost town feel in basically all of these kind of downtowns and city centers before everyone got a handle on what outdoor dining might look like. There was legislation that had to do with cocktails to go and other innovations there. There was the sourdough at home. There were closures of locally beloved eateries, the rise of kind of new classics and some really interesting small joints. So, how have you tried to track essentially how we felt about the pandemic through these changes in food? I really love that you brought up labor, and we're going to get to that, I think, more toward the end of the conversation. But thinking about where food is made and what role it has in kind of bringing people out. What did the pandemic sort of reveal for you?
Oh, where to begin with that question? So many ways to answer that. I think what it really revealed to me, because I had always been a food first person. Like, I don't care. You can serve me in a closet and like you can hit me on the head with the plate as you put it down, like so long as the food really tastes great. I'm not going to be upset about much of the other things, but what I began to understand on a more visceral level is the importance of the hospitality itself to diners, and that's the reason, as much as anything, if not more so, that people go out to eat, is that feeling of community and gathering and being cared for, and being in relationship with other humans. I think there are ways, ironically, that eating professionally as a restaurant critic sort of deprives you of that in a way that can take a writer away from like the actual function of actually eating out for your readers. So it was interesting to really understand that and to start shifting the way that I saw that, and the importance of that. So that was
Mm.
one thing. I mean, there are so many things I could say about that, but also, you mentioned the ghost town of downtown, and the Globe office is right downtown. And certainly I would say that for the restaurants around there, it hasn't necessarily changed for some of them, for a lot of them. And I went and grabbed some takeout recently from a newer restaurant around there, and I was just talking with the owner, and she just said, yeah, I don't know if I can stay open because people still are not going to the office in those downtown areas. And it's sort of right now, it's this very off balance thing of some restaurants being packed and it's hard to get a reservation and it feels so busy when you go out to dinner, and then these other places just getting no business at all. And how is this going to tip as we see people move out toward the suburbs where more people may be working from home and more centrally located, and also where it's less expensive and easier to operate in many ways, and there's parking and all of those things. um
I am curious about What is your read, speaking of that, on kind of efforts to get folks back downtown? Because Boston has an ad campaign right now that's specifically focused on kind of like lunch at home versus downtown, that, in my view at least, kind of weirdly dunks on packing your own lunch. It seems to imply that your sandwiches that you make for yourself are bad. But, is a very food focused kind of attempt to sort of get that sort of city center feeling going again. So have you noticed anything about the way that cities and towns specifically around Greater Boston have been dealing with this space in between? Things are either closed or outdoor dining, but everything is not kind of, back in the way that it might like to be.
I appreciate that ad campaign, and I also feel like best of luck. Like, I don't think that wishful thinking is gonna make downtowns come back. I am sadly not a policymaker, and but I think that I think there's going to need to be some real effort and real thinking around that, which I'm sure there is, and I know there is, but I don't know what the answer to bringing people back downtown during the day in the way that it used to be is going to be, particularly with the housing situation. And so, yeah, I suspect those things are interrelated, housing and having people downtown.
This might be a little bit of a loaded question, but I guess, is that a problem conceptually in ways separate from the business sense? We're going to talk a bit about the things that you looked at in 2023 and kind of looking forward into 2024. But as with things that are not just sourdough, people really did spend the last few years cooking at home. And so there's been a bit of a pivot in the way that, for instance, markets and food have approached the idea of your home might be the best restaurant that you currently have access to. So have you seen anything in restaurant trends or in market trends that have made you think that we're reassessing what it means to kind of enjoy good dining, not even fine dining, but like good, excellent food?
I would say, certainly the crowds that are out in the hot new restaurants that are opening, when Amar opened at Raffles, like you couldn't get a reservation to save your life. And I ate dinner at like 9:30 on a Tuesday just because I was like able to sneak in. They took pity on me. And so I think, you know, that is promising, but also I really wonder about the sustainability of this because we have so many restaurants. There's restaurants keep opening all the time. And so we'll support you when you've just opened. We'll come out in droves. But how about a year in, 2 years in? What is it going to take now to open and run a successful restaurant over time? So I do wonder a lot about the sustainability, but that said, I'm going to take, these full dining rooms and this lively scene as a positive sign in that regard. Also, I do think that takeout and delivery are these very vital streams for restaurants now, much more than they were prior to the pandemic. And, fast casual takeout delivery kinds of options are going to remain important for restaurants, as secondary revenue streams or, tertiary, I don't know. And so, we'll continue to see more of that and hopefully, and so new models, we see a lot of these places opening that are like, it's a grocery store with like some fancy fun stuff and some regular everyday stuff. And also you can get takeout and also maybe there's a pop-up arm to it. That kind of, model or things that take you through the day. You can come get coffee and some pastry and have a meeting with your client and you can work there, you can get your lunch there, and then at night you can have a cocktail or a non-alcoholic cocktail and eat dinner and gather, and maybe there's something like, bocce court or, some other kind of, because people are looking for these experiences or something to do while they're eating, board games. I just think any any place that can touch on multiple bases, we're going to just keep seeing more of that. And also like themed dinners and cookbook clubs and things that bring people back regularly and give you like more reason than just going out to dinner, because there are so many places that you can go out to dinner. Proximity, parking, all of these things are going to come into play. I also, it's winter and I just got an email from, one of my medical providers saying, we're instituting masks again because spread is extremely high right now, COVID, flu, RSV, and we like to talk as if we're back in normal times, but who knows what can happen in the future in terms of that kind of thing. And if everybody starts getting sick, maybe people stop going out less again, during the winter, which is already a very slow time. It's hard for restaurants when they maybe tend to go out of business. And if they didn't have bang up holiday seasons with all those holiday parties that used to get them through the slow times, then what? And also the election is coming up and what's going to happen there may have all unseen, unforetold effects. So it's just, it's always sort of a work in progress and we'll just see.
Yeah. Well, we've got maybe a little bit of 2020 hindsight then, because let's talk about last year and then let's talk about this year, which I believe is 2024. I'm not sure yet. We're all only 4 days in.
Yeah, I can't, I keep saying 2023, so we'll just go, I think
Exactly.
it's 2024. Yeah.
It's 2020 something. I was delighted to see Comfort Kitchen, which is pretty near me in Dorchester, get your kind of top mark for 2023 in terms of overall restaurants. But I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the way that you were approaching what is it that makes a best of in 2023? What was different this last year than other years? And was there anything that kind of surprised you in restaurant trends or restaurateurs?
Right. I mean, well, first I'll speak, to Comfort Kitchen, which I think for me, as always, the thing is it has to have consistent, delicious food. And Comfort Kitchen really nails that. It had a lot of time to sort of test and refine its concepts. It started as a pop-up in JP for quite some time. And so I think it really got everything into shape so it could really hit the ground running when it opened in the brick and mortar in Dorchester. I think also it has this very lovely sense of hospitality, but it's also just very casual. It's not like one of those places where they call you madam and what I mean? It's not like tableclothy and formal. It's just like genuine hospitality. And I do think that in restaurants in 2024, like what is hospitality? I think it's what really makes you feel good as a human rather than like this is a fancy thing, because eating out has become so much more of a regular thing than it was in the era of, and hello, sir, how are we doing this evening? Now it's sort of more of a feeling of we're all in this together. And I think that Comfort Kitchen is really lovely in the way that it welcomes in everybody in the area. And it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, what handbag you have, like what car you drove in on, like you took the T or hopefully you biked, like everybody has the same experience. And the food, I think another thing that we're seeing from restaurants and will continue to see from restaurants is the concept of telling a story, having something beyond like we have French food, or this is a restaurant, where it's like at Comfort Kitchen, they've taken the African diaspora and the like trading routes of spices, the maritime trading routes, and sort of trace those through space and time, and how it's sort of, how does food evolve? Like how do we as humans in different cultures like adapt and adopt to hardships and necessity and migration. And so I think it's intellectually interesting and satisfying, if you want to think about it, but also you don't have to think about it. You can just eat and drink and have a good time. And so I think that's really nice. I think people are wanting to see more stories like that presented. We've talked a lot about cultural appropriation and the restaurant space, and Comfort Kitchen is owned and run by immigrants and women and queer people, and doing something really interesting, and new that feels like it could succeed in any city. It's here in Boston. It's in Dorchester, and to see fine dining, it got recognized by the New York Times in Dorchester, like, get national attention is really satisfying to me as somebody who spent a lot of time in Dorchester over the years and didn't see that happening. It's like Boston's biggest neighborhood, and it's just, I love Dorchester because I worked there for so long. The Globe offices were there, and it's just really pleases me to see it recognized.
You and me both. I think
Yeah.
it's
I had a feeling
no
you'd come
mystery
for
to
me.
anyone listening to this.
Yeah.
I'm a number one Dorchester booster. I also wanted to touch on kind of the accompaniment, if anything else. Don't usually talk about food without also talking about drinks. And so there's sort of a look back, a look forward here, where one thing that you noted as kind of an innovation was more the use of like BYOB, bring your own booze, beer, depending on your license. It can mean whatever B you want, which is something that you think would be more common, especially in places like Boston, which allows you to have BYOB licenses, but isn't really all that common. And then you have the broader question of what do you do with people literally drinking less? It's dry January right now, but if people still want something fun to drink, they still probably want to try and find something more interesting than flat or sparkling water. So, what have you seen last year in terms of drink trends, and how are you envisioning kind of a pivot going forward, especially as people are drinking less than they used to?
Well, I think licensing in Boston and the various forms that takes is a whole stew that maybe, we'll keep that issue separate for now. Um, People are just drinking less, and particularly younger people and the sort of people who are more likely to go out like every night, um, are drinking less. And there are a lot of reasons for that, health awareness and health stuff. And the rise in recreational marijuana and just all kinds of things. We have this like fitness culture where you can fine tune yourself with apps and adaptogens, and I think that's really affecting it as well. So that is a big way that restaurants make money, is through alcohol sales. So I think restaurants need to respond to that change and also want to respond to that change. And so we do see these non-alcoholic cocktail programs coming up, and there are so many more new products coming onto the scene in terms of, alcohol-free bitters and, mixers and all kinds of things where we can make you a really tasty drink playing on all of our bartender skills. And it's going to be just like drinking a cocktail in every way, except for one, which is that you're not going to get drunk and you're not going to be consuming alcohol. I think for people who are engaged in sobriety, this is like a really wonderful thing. You can go out with your friends now and not feel like any kind of pressure or left outness. And I just think we are going to continue to see more of this. I spoke with someone in the beverage industry who said, it's now mandatory for restaurants to have non-alcoholic options that are satisfying. It's not, it's like they compared it to cider. Suddenly you had to have a cider line. Now you have to have non-alcoholic alternatives. And we're just going to keep seeing more of that for as long as this is a trend, which I see it continuing to be. And I think, maybe we'll start seeing more use of adaptogenic ingredients. If you want to fine tune your mood in some way, like this cocktail contains herbs that will chill you out. So, and things also that will like be okay, like you just ate a lot of gummies, like, here is a cocktail that will accompany you in that way. So we'll see, I just think things are going to get better tasting. We're also, seeing that labor crunch for bars. So where, a few years back, you would see all these handmade syrups and essences and concentrates and things like that. I think there's a lot less time to just be making all those fun, cool things anymore. So, we're going to see pre-prepared products that do some of that work already, and those can be mixed with, sparkling water or whatever.
And to kind of touch on that labor question there, in your look ahead for 2024, you did identify sort of these labor shortages. And the shortages that we've been seeing have often been due to, as you noted, kind of labor and condition disputes, especially during the pandemic. So what's the sense that you've gotten from talking with folks? Is this expected to be kind of a continuous problem going forward into the next year, or has there been any kind of breaking, softening in there?
On the shortage itself,
Yeah.
I don't think that we are going to see any change on that. And in fact, it's going to likely get worse because, I spoke with Jerry Rubin, who is a visiting fellow at the Project on the Workforce at Harvard. And he co-authored this report addressing the labor shortage in Massachusetts. It's pretty eye-opening report. And what he also found, delving into the data, that it is a problem for Massachusetts. We have this aging population. There more people are leaving than coming in who are able to work, and more people dying than being born. And it's not a good recipe for labor. It's not a good outlook. But nationally, there's going to be struggles around this. And in terms of what might ease that pain, certainly things like a better working conditions, higher pay are great. And then there's only, I think, so much that restaurants can really do that because there's not much financial leeway in that regard. And, I've had chefs say to me, like, we used to look for people with real skills. Now we just look for people with a pulse. Like, it's pretty dire, and Jerry Rubin said it's only going to get worse from here. I think if there is any kind of answer, it's that where the population is increasing is in terms of immigration, and that it's not just food service, it's service in general, and particularly the healthcare industry. This is a real issue, and we have this migrant population arriving, waiting to be able to work, waiting to get papers so that they can work. I know everybody's working on this, and it's speeding up, it's getting better, but here we do have this pool of potential new labor, and that might be helpful. But also, again, what happens in the next election may affect immigration patterns. So it's really, I don't know. I just think it's going to continue to be a pain point for restaurants and service industries in general.
All right. Final one. The restaurant critic as a concept is often considered someone who like hides their face, wears a fake mustache, puts on the fedora, sneaks into the restaurant, reviews it secretly, whatever. What's your process? Do you have to hide yourself, or at this point, everyone's on the internet, you just kind of assume?
I think for anybody sort of coming in to restaurant criticism, which is definitely fewer, there aren't nationally that many restaurant critics anymore because of what's happening in journalism, budgetary concerns. It is a job that to sort of do it journalistically takes a budget. And so certainly we've seen a cutting back on that across the board. But anybody now, it's the internet, and anybody's image is on it. I've sort of tried to keep my image out of it as much as possible. And that's, probably as much for my own sake as anything. Some people have said, I'm coming out and like, posted their pictures in other cities. And there's all kinds of ways to do it, none of them right or wrong, just different approaches. But I think for me, having the notion, like even if everybody recognizes me, which I think sometimes people do, and I think sometimes people still don't, but having to pretend that I'm not getting special treatment, even if they do recognize me, is actually helpful for everybody. It's helpful for me. I've gone out to eat with people whose images are out there and they get like a lot of freebies and special treatment, and the chef comes over and they get the best table, and it really does make a difference. And I'd at least like to have the pretense of being treated like any diner who comes in. I think it helps rein in that impulse. And I also think sometimes people get nervous. And so maybe it's helpful to them if they don't know who I am in some way as well. So, I make reservations under a different name. I use a credit card with a different name. I just try to go in and eat and have as regular of an experience or as close to the experience that other people might have when they go to the restaurant. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again to Devra First for joining me on the podcast. You will probably not see her out there, but it's possible that you will. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week. Happy New Year.